Really? Tell us about it.
Well, I went to Croatia. I went to Morocco to visit my family for a while.
Wonderful.
Well, first, before that, we went to the Northeast. So we spent a lot of time in Boston and New Hampshire and New York and Boston with the kids. And then I went to see my family in Morocco. Um, and then, hold on one second. I'm on a Zoom call. I'm on a Zoom call. I think they left. Sorry. Um, Yeah, and then we went to Croatia with just my husband and I, which is was
Nice.
so needed, like so needed.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And now I'm back to routine. September, kids back to school. I have a
Uh-huh.
high schooler. I have a high schooler.
That's
It,
amazing.
it's crazy. It's like very difficult for me to comprehend that I have a high schooler
Wow.
because I feel like I'm the kid most of the time. So that
Well,
that was my summer.
congratulations.
Thank you.
You got a child to high school. I mean, that feels so far away for me.
and
Um,
and homeschooling half of it,
right.
which was challenging.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, we're glad to see your beautiful face. And did
Mm.
you do any kind of exploration with any bees while you were traveling?
Yes, I actually went on this property and they had beehives
Uh-huh.
in what was it? In Maine.
Nice.
Yeah, so it was fun. It was fun how they always tend to call you. Like, hey, I probably 5 years ago would have never paid attention that the property had beehives, but it just you start to be aware of where they are.
Right. Right. That
I
makes
got I got stung by a bee. I found out that I am mildly allergic to these things.
okay.
Yeah, so it got swollen and it hurt and it happened the day before I left on my trip, which is very odd. I chose to sleep in my tent that night by myself, just because I'm gonna be leaving my tent for a while. Um, and I got stung that night and it was really bad. So I figured like I needed to take something with me. I'm not sure. I just felt like there was more to it because I would never get stung
Uh-huh.
randomly like that on my leg, but it got really swollen and um yeah.
Well, are you sure? Did it happen at night, you said?
Yes, it happened while I was sleeping. But I felt it and I woke up and it like took the bee out of my
Oh,
leg.
wow.
Yeah, it
Interesting.
was really bad.
Wow.
And the thing spread maybe like about 6-inch radius.
Uh-huh.
And you can tell like where the venom have traveled um on that part. So yeah,
I
I
think
don't
it
know
was
if it's gonna
probably a
get worse.
blessing. It was probably a blessing that you had that old jolt of medicine before you were traveling.
To be honest with you, that's how I took it. I know I'm probably the only one who took it like that. My whole family's like, oh, you keep bees and they sting you and you're allergic and you should not be keeping bees.
Okay, well today, hi everyone that's here. Marlena, how are you? You're in a car. Um, Today's gonna be a little technical, and I apologize if it's, too kind of like heady and detailed, but it is some information that I want to get through so that you have it like in your sphere, and that way you know about these concepts, and when you go further in your beekeeping journey, you will have heard them and then you'll have like some foundation. So let me share my screen here. Um, you can see my screen, yes? Slides. Thank you. Um, okay. So today we are gonna jump right in. Thanks for meeting me a few minutes past the hour. We probably will take the full time and we will take a break in between, or excuse me, halfway through. If you have to jump off and do other things that were scheduled for today with your life, no worries. The recording will be available to you to catch up on. After today's class, we have one meeting at the end of the month, which is our equinox celebration, and we'll also do like a recap. And then one more session in October, which will be for your final project presentation. So we are almost finished with our time together. Today and the next two sessions would be your opportunity to ask any lingering questions, bring up anything that's still unclear for you. And of course, I am available to you even after our official course is closed. But yeah, I can't believe it. We're in September. So today we're going to talk about pests and diseases, fall management, and winterization. And kind of like some inspiration for the upcoming season to start thinking about, which will make sense when I get to that point. And then we'll close our session for today. So last month we talked about honey, and some of you were able to give me, well, share with the rest of us your meditation with honey. If you'd like to, you can write it out and share it in the classroom if you feel so moved. But I actually went into the hives on Thursday. I gave a workshop here in town about honey, and I had opened my hives, and the goal was for me to take out a frame of honey and take it to the workshop and show folks how to harvest it. And then we talked about different recipes with honey. And then I showed them how to make a herbal throat syrup with herbs and honey. And then I showed them how to make a face mask. And then I showed them how to make baklava, which is very honey rich. So I'll share those recipes with you in the classroom. But as I was in the beehives, I was so thrilled. I was like, thank you, goddess. The 3 full hives that I have were packed with honey on the top. The other 3 that are still small, I'm going to be combining them in the next week, and I will take a video and show you that process. But the 3 of them, one was from last year and 2 were from trees, established hives that have been in trees for year after year after year. And a colleague of mine brought me swarms, and they are just amazing. They're thriving. So I'm very excited. I've been, if you remember, like I've been slowly building up this apiary here, and it's been kind of a struggle to learn about this climate here and adapt. But I think we're making progress. So I feel like just so grateful that it's happening. We have gone through the seasons together, pretty much late winter through autumn now, almost autumn. And as we've been talking about, each season brings a different focus for what we're working on with the hive. And now that summer is coming to a close, the honey production, unless you're somewhere that has lots of flowers still, right now I actually have a goldenrod bloom, and this tends to be for our area the last bloom really before cold weather kind of sets in. So the field and my hillsides are full of goldenrod, which is also an amazing medicinal. But the bees love to make honey from goldenrod, and I saw a new comb being built out with nectar, and it is like this really light yellow, very very bright. It was almost just like they took the color of the goldenrod and put it into the comb. It's really beautiful. I'll try and get a picture for you. But in other areas of the country, you know, California still gets a lot of blooms through November, probably, especially since you guys had so much rain this year. And then there's some areas that the colder weather sets in a lot sooner, like if you go further up north. But in general, as the summer is coming to a close, we know that the length of the day, where the daylight hours is decreasing. And the queen takes that cue to start laying less eggs. And we have this awareness as we go into winter that the hive is preparing to kind of hunker down for that cold weather. The winterization prep that we'll talk about, the bees are already preparing for winter right now. And as a matter of fact, they pretty much prepare for winter year round. All of that honey creation and storage is to really get them through winter. So it seems like they may always be living in the future, but I think that it's kind of an interesting lesson for us to be in observance, how they are so immersed in their everyday existence, but yet always planning, you know, for the days to come. So today we're gonna talk about September through December seasons. And we've said this before, and I'm going to just keep reminding you some of the like ideal times, you know, when we're opening the hive. We're not doing it on a rainy day when it's cold or windy. Ideally, nothing less than 70 degrees. If you have to get in there quickly and it's, you know, 65, you can do it, but not trying to get into the brood box. So now's your opportunity to really get in those last inspections, those last interactions with your hives before we start to, you know, transition to the dream time again, where we're meeting them kind of like in the dream and meditative space. After September, the physical interaction with the bees is pretty minimum, unless you're sitting outside of the hive, and you can do that, observe them on warm days. But that activity is really starting to go down, and it's a lot of effort for them to keep the hive warm. So that's why we're always reminding ourselves to, you know, be diligent with the timing of when we're opening up the hive, right? One thing I will say is that now is also a time, especially in Southern California, where we see, not just Southern California, excuse me, now is the time where we see like a lot of fires happening in areas that may not have seen enough water this year. So things like ants and robbing is kind of like at the all-time high right now, because there is less nectar in some areas if it is really dry. So these are the things you have to be on top of, like making sure the ants are not getting into the hive. And we've covered that, like making sure you have your ant barriers, and then also having a entrance reducer at the opening of the hive to make sure that the robbing is kept at a minimum, because there's other hives that are out there right now being opportunistic, looking for food to harvest from smaller hives that are easy to take from. And we've also talked about what is a healthy hive when we're seeing things like brood, pollen, and honey, when we're seeing the queen, if possible. If we don't see her, but we see eggs and larvae, we know that she's there. We want to see that there's enough food for them, meaning there's at least 50 pounds of honey for the winter months. You know, technically, for me, the cold weather doesn't really start until December, really. It kind of really follows the winter solstice. But between now and that time, the goldenrod and maybe a few other wildflowers are all that's left. So you'll hear this number a lot, like a certain number of pounds that bees need to get through winter. But it can actually be a lot longer, that time period. You know, for us here, end of March is when there's another bloom again. So that's pretty significant timing, like almost 5 months of food that they're needing. Now, of course, as I just mentioned, the queen is reducing her egg laying. So the population size is going to really go down. So they don't require as much food, but at the same time, the energy usage goes up because they're having to keep themselves warm. So a healthy hive is going to have a lot of that storage going into winter. Right now, though, you may see indicators of a failing hive, meaning you may not see brood, eggs, larvae. That's your indication that there's no queen present. If there's no queen present, then a lot of things tend to start spiraling. You may notice that there is an explosion of drones being laid. And we've covered this before, but if a queen happens to die unexpectedly, the workers will start laying eggs, which are not fertilized. If we remember, they don't have that ability to lay a fertilized egg. So they will lay unfertilized eggs, which are just drones. And that, of course, is to this kind of like last effort to ensure the genetics of the hive are carried forward. So you may see an explosion in drone brood, or you may see a lot of queen cells being built out. And that's another indication that something happened to your queen. So they're trying to raise a new one. If you're noticing that your population size is drastically dropping right now, that's another indicator that something is going on. And typically right now is the time where varroa mite is at its peak. And we're going to cover what the varroa mite is in a few minutes. But again, like I really encourage you, if you have a hive, now's the time to really spend some extra hours making sure that everything is okay. Getting in there maybe every week until it really starts to get too cold, so that you are sure that they're set up for success. And just as a refresh, you know, during the summer, we're trying to keep up with their production. We're keeping them in their hive by adding more boxes as they keep growing in size and adding more honey. That's like one of the main things that we're doing in that summer maintenance. Of course, we're extracting honey if there's honey to do that, and you know, helping them with this hot weather. But now we are coming to that summer close, and we're going to start to tweak some of the maintenance as we move towards the colder weather. So something that I don't know if I talked about this before, but I wanted to make sure I covered this, is the concept or the technique of counting bees. And this, of course, you have these slides. But as we're talking about like, well, how strong is my hive, or how big is it? These are some ways that you can guess this population size. As we're going into winter, we want to see at least, so I'm going to pause, at least 2 deep boxes, which is where the brood are, right? Full. We would love to see that those 2 deep boxes are full of brood, pollen, and some honey in there. And ideally, an even better scenario would be if they had honey in the super, at least 5 frames there. So let's kind of go through some of these bullet points. So a shallow frame or a honey super frame, fully covered with bees, holds about 1/4 of a pound of bees, which is about 875 bees. A deep frame, which we just talked about in your brood boxes, the big box, holds about 1/2 pound of bees, and that's about 1,700. And then per pound, there's usually about 3,500 bees. Now, you can get a little bit more technical here. 1 square inch of comb has 25 cells. And usually there's about 5 worker cells per inch, or 4 drone cells per inch. So you know the lengths of your frames, and if they're excuse me, or then you can also take a tape measure. You can measure out how much brood is there with your measuring tape. You can see in this bottom photo that the person's hand is pointing to that brood. If you were to brush the bees away, you can take an estimate of how much brood is present by using the measurements, how many square inches you have, right? And then to help you estimate how much honey is in your boxes, a deep frame that is fully filled with honey is 10 pounds, while a super or medium frame is 5 to 7 pounds, depending on how thick that is. So when you see a honey super box, usually that third box, the shallow or medium, I realize that there are kind of these interchangeable words. So the shallow box is also the honey super or a medium, depending on who you're talking to. If that is totally full, then you have at least 50 pounds there of honey, which is awesome, really significant, right? You will find deep frames in your brood boxes that will also have honey. And typically they'll have anywhere between 2 and 4. So that's another 40 pounds. If there is 4, 20 to 40 pounds. So in this time, this is a good time also for you to get into the brood boxes and see how much honey is in there, how much pollen, and how much brood you have when you're going into winter. That way you can have a good sense of where they stand at the end of the summer season and how much reserves they have to last them through winter. And we'll talk about some of these winterizing techniques again. But these are some tricks for you to estimate how much is in your hive. And then for honey flow, I just wanted to remind you that if you're looking in your hive right now and you might still see some honey being processed and made, that's great. The uncapped cells are going to be that nectar, and then your capped cells are going to be honey, right? When you open the hive and if you smell like a strong sweet smell, that's a good thing. That's telling you that there's a lot of nectar still being brought in, and the honey is ripening, which is like a good thing. If you're still seeing a lot of white wax being built out, kind of like in this photo, they're slowly adding that white capping, that wax on top of the ripened honey. That's also a good sign that they're still processing. When they're also still working on honey, you'll notice that the bees are still very docile. They're still foraging a lot. You'll see bees flying in and out. As the resources start to go down, you'll notice that the activity also starts to minimize at the entrance. They're starting to save their energy. They know that there's not that much out there to collect. So they're kind of turning inward and getting their house ready for hibernation. Okay, so as I mentioned, this time of year is typically when you're going to see issues with pests and diseases. And so I will preface this by saying that as natural beekeepers, the pest and disease conversation is interesting because you will find that there are beekeepers out there who are very, very strict with the natural beekeeping or biodynamic dogma approach to, working with bees. And those at the extreme end, you will find don't even pay attention to these conversations around pests and disease. You will find that they're not even investing any time or resources into any kind of interference with the hive if there is a pest or a disease present that they know of. You'll find a lot of beekeepers at that end of the spectrum that are very hands-off, as we've talked about, and will allow the bees to work it out the way it's supposed to. Then at the other end of the spectrum is the conventional beekeeper who is thoroughly involved and does a lot of manipulation. For you to have a good foundation of moving forward in your bee journey, as I've told you before, I always strive to give you like both ends of the spectrum so that you can land on what feels right for you. So I'm going to share with you briefly some of the pests, diseases, and then treatments that are out there in the bee world. And it's good to have an awareness of what some of these pests and diseases are so that if you do come across it, at least you can identify it. And then if you decide to take action, you will have some starting point. To go into a lot of detail on each one of these treatments would be like a second year class. So I'm not going to do like a deep dive into that management, but we'll talk a little bit about it. Okay, so the first few are kind of actually I want to start with, let me start with these first. Some of these bugs that you'll see, bugs and creatures that you'll see inside of the beehive, okay? So let's start with some of the larger organisms that you may or may not have already seen. Most notably ants, right? You can raise your hand or type in the chat or comment if you've seen ants in your beehive. I have had ants in my beehive. I've also had mice, and I am lucky that I have not dealt with raccoons or bears in my beehive, but these are some of the larger organisms that you will have to deal with depending on where you are. And there's different approaches. We've kind of touched on some of these, but just for some refresh, if we're dealing with ants, there are these ant barriers that we've talked about, creating a little moat under the stand of the hive to prevent the ants from climbing up. As we go into winter, we typically put something called a mouse, what is it called? A mouse guard. Let me put that in the chat. Chat box. not my chat box. I will send you actually a picture. It'll be a lot easier to talk through. A mouse guard. It kind of has like these, it looks like a grate, and then it is placed at the entrance of the hive, but then it has these little holes in it so that the bees can continue to fly in and out through winter, but the mice cannot get in to hibernate through winter. And as I showed you some pictures, I think a couple sessions ago, I ended up finding a mouse that had made a nest in one of my beehives this past winter. And then, eventually drove the hive out because it had brought in so much material. If you remember those photos, there was like stuffing. I don't even know where this mouse got all of these things. Feathers, soft like fabric. It was incredible. And they'll try to hibernate in that warm hive over winter. So a mouse guard, and I'll send a picture to you guys what that looks like. To do with your larger creatures, we always use ratchet straps around the hive, and that also helps in the wintertime when weather starts to get a little bit crazy. And then for the bears, mostly you'll find folks putting electric netting or wiring around their hives. And those can also be as simple as putting T-posts and having hot wire, 3 or 4 strands of hot wire, which is less, less of an investment as opposed to building like a huge fence. So that's an option for bears. But the pests can be a real problem depending on where you are, but those are the main ones. Now, hive beetles are another one that can be a pest, but most likely end up being a symbiotic relationship. The beetles like to eat some of the honey and the wax that's inside of the hive. And you'll find that the bees can often manage the population of the hive beetle by removing them or killing them. When it does become an issue is if the hive beetle is able to lay eggs inside, which it does occasionally, and larvae, and that ends up, exploding and being too much for the hive, the honeybees to manage. So the bees will leave, and I've had this happen to me a couple times with weaker hives that were too small to defend their hive from all those tiny little beetles. In general, though, especially in California and drier regions, you will find the hive beetle. You'll notice when you open the lid, you might see them scurrying around, but it usually is not a problem. That doesn't end up being a severe problem. Now, the wax moth is horrid, and I just lost so much of my equipment to wax moth. So it's like always learning. It's so funny. I had some wax moth issues when I was in California, but apparently the wax moth is more prevalent here where it is more humid. This is a moth that gets into the hive, lays its egg that turns into a larva, and you can see those pictures there, that picture there that has the circles. Those larvae end up being like these giant caterpillars, and they eat through the wax. And then as they eat through, they like poop out this disgusting web. And it just turns into a horrible, horrible mess. If you have an active beehive and there's too much wax moth larva inside, it will drive the bees out very, very quickly. It smells, it's disgusting. It is really awful. And the only thing you can do is if you find you have a hive that is lost to the wax moth, you either have to compost all of that comb, or what I like to do is rip the comb out, give it to my chickens, and they love to eat all of that. And then you can compost the rest. But it is awful. And what ends up happening is if you store your equipment in a dark place with no circulation, air circulation, this is how they move in. And I had a bunch of my equipment here in the basement, and only a couple of weeks ago, I found that it was like totally infested. And so I had to scour the whole basement for wax moth, for larvae. The other part is they like to burrow into the wood of the boxes and the frames. And so it was just a horrible disaster. So one of my mentors here says that if you're stacking your equipment and then putting it on a pallet and having the airflow, then you will reduce the risk of that wax moth. So just so you know, it's horrible. I'm going to pause for a sip of water. I've been talking a lot. Any questions or comments right now?
I actually have one. Would it be possible to store extra frames and boxes in like a plastic massive storage bin? Would they still get in that way? Like
They
even if
still
you
get
like
in.
if really? What if you duct tape it?
You need to find the ones that I'm trying to think. What kind of, yeah, if you like seal every corner and not use one like plastic totes that are just a lid and a bottom, like get the ones that are like snap
Yeah.
and seal corners, seal everything, then you might be able to get away with it. The
Okay.
best solution is if you have frames with any kind of pollen, honey in it, it would ideally go in the freezer. Otherwise, you're just going to attract any creature to come and devour it. That's the best solution, especially for honey. And that way, like if it gets nicked or the wax happens to scrape, you're not wasting any of that. But when I was in California, obviously I had a lot of frames that were just comb, leftover comb. And so we had them stacked outside on pallets. We would put the frames in the boxes and just stacked, no bottom, or we did put a bottom so mice couldn't get in. But that was a screened bottom board so that there was still ventilation, and then the lid. So like kind of like you just had a super huge hive. And that was fine. But yes, you can do totes. You just have to, yes, over duct tape.
Okay.
So then some of the like these pathogens and one more parasite or pests that we'll talk about. These are kind of like the more serious infestations that can happen. So you'll notice here that one is a fungus, one is a bacteria, and this other one is a mite. So let's start with the nosema. Okay, so as bees are out in the wild, they're coming into contact with all kinds of other creatures and organisms, and of course on the flowers. And you know, they can pick up all kinds of microorganisms just like we do being out in the world. And also, if some kind of other organism happens to get into the hive, that means that they're bringing something in as well, right? So with nosema, this is a fungus or fungi that happens to get into the hive. And usually what ends up happening, it becomes inoculated into the bee's body. And it specifically invades the digestive system. And it's really bad what ends up happening to the bees. They get really sick. Essentially, they're not able to absorb nutrients from their food anymore. And they end up having diarrhea, which is actually a thing that you can see from the honeybees. You'll notice if there is any kind of illness in the hive, that there is splatters of yellow, it's actually poop, like yellow poop, but you'll notice that it's like splattered at the entrance of the hive. And that means that that was the bees trying to get out as quickly as they could to defecate outside, which they do naturally. They don't poop inside of the hive. But it becomes like so frequent. And then of course, like with any kind of situation with diarrhea, you can become severely dehydrated and malnourished. And so this fungi, it's gnarly. Nosema is not something that is how do I want to say it? It's not something that you will see very often. It can happen, but on the spectrum of how frequent, it's probably on the less end, less frequent. When we talk about varroa, you will 100% encounter varroa mite, if not every year, depending on where you are with your bees. And but the nosema tends to be something that is not as frequent, but I want you to know about it. And then foul brood is also another horrible, horrible one. It can happen, but it's also, again, on the spectrum of doesn't happen as much anymore. This can be transmitted pretty easily, and it's because it's a bacteria. So whenever we're working on our hives, we want to have clean equipment. That means like your hive tool, your gloves. Like you would never use your bee gloves to do anything else besides working with the bees. And the same thing like with your hive tool. All of your tools for the hive should be just for beekeeping. And then you should also clean it once in a while, if not every time. You know, using things like rubbing alcohol to clean the hive tools. But anyway, of course, this can be transmitted by other organisms, and it ends up affecting the brood specifically. As the nurse bees and worker bees are feeding brood, they end up transmitting the bacteria, and then it essentially like disintegrates the brood within the cell. And so if you're noticing that your hive population is decreasing, and then you're noticing also that the wax cappings of the brood ends up being sunken and black or brown, then you have a pretty serious infection happening. This type of situation is not recoverable, and more than likely the bees will die out fairly quickly because you know, it's only going to take a few cycles for all the larvae to be affected. And then with this situation, and most likely with nosema, if you had either one, you would end up having to burn everything, which is, it's just really sad, but you have to burn the equipment, you have to burn the comb, because those pathogens can stay inside of your equipment, and you don't want to transmit it to another hive trying it again. So just so you're aware, again, it's not as frequent, but it is out there. I have had a couple clients, and one time myself, I did have foul brood once, a long time ago. So it can be something that you encounter. And then varroa. I mean, varroa is something that you're going to hear everyone talk about at some point as a beekeeper. And depending on where you live, varroa is either a serious problem or is a moderate problem. Varroa mite is, let's see, where do I have my pictures? I have pictures of the varroa mite somewhere. Just give me a moment. Yes, I don't in here. Okay, yeah, this is fine. So if you look at this picture here, that larva that is in the bottom picture, that red dot on it is a varroa mite. And currently, varroa is everywhere now. It actually was brought to this continent from Asia. And initially, when it was first introduced by accident, of course, or maybe not by accident, but it was introduced and it totally decimated beehives commercially, mostly I would say in the 90s, towards the mid 80s to 90s. Like commercial beekeeping was collapsing because of this varroa mite. And what it does is the varroa mite attaches itself into the brood, into the larva, and sucks the the blood, the juices, all of the things from the larva. And obviously the larva then will develop inside of their cells and become deformed and or unable to develop at all. The other problem that ends up happening is that varroa can then be a vector for transmission for some of these other pathogens that we just talked about. You might find, like, if you're paying attention and you have, lots of time in your garden, you could see varroa actually like jumping from one bee to another bee. And you would most likely find that kind of situation in commercial large scale farming. But oh, thank goodness. Jewel is, you want to look at the chat? Yeah, so it is a very it's a very hard conversation. And I think that, from all of us on this call, I know that we are all more naturally, we look at our lives like with a different holistic approach, right? And this whole problem with varroa mite is kind of like another mirror for us to reflect on society at large. Society at large, relies on antibiotics, eats terribly, has a diet that's poorly balanced, has not enough nutrition, has a lot of sugar, a lot of chemicals. And so what happened to the bees with varroa mite is exactly what's happening to the health of the majority of people. You just become so unable to live unless you have these crutches that have been so indoctrinated, right, into society. And so it happened to the bees. The varroa mite took advantage of this situation where bees were, not able to eat their honey because they were fed sugar water after every honey harvest. They were moved around the country. They were given antibiotics, literally, like for any kind of illness. They have only access to one plant at a time that's typically covered in chemicals and pesticides. And so, I mean, it's not a far stretch of the imagination if you have been present for the last few years to see like why this is such an opportunistic organism. So the health of the bees, like overall, is again why natural beekeepers focus so much on the holistic approach, which is, should I be keeping bees in the first place in my space? Is the landscape healthy? My forest here that I'm stewarding, is it actually healthy enough for the bees? By year 3 now, I'm seeing that hives can thrive here. And it took a while probably because the rest of this land that we're managing was not tended to. And there was probably chemicals put out there, and we're growing new plants and we're trying to restore the habitat. So the bees that I have now that are finally thriving shows me a snapshot of this landscape that it's okay, like they're doing great. Now we're going to talk about like management with this, but you know, every August, September, it's good for you to do a varroa mite sampling, which I'm going to do this coming week, and I'll take a video to show you, so that you can get a sense of how much are you dealing with. Varroa is pretty much like present almost in every beehive. And I even had varroa mites in the hives in Southern California. But it becomes a problem when the hive itself is not thriving. Just like when our inner landscape, our inner biome is not thriving and in balance, that's when we experience illness, right? And I know that there's a lot of different perspectives with things like terrain theory and new German medicine. So we can have that conversation another time. But in general, I think we're almost like all on the same page with that. And if you have a different opinion, feel free to offer it right now. But anyway, varroa mite, it's like you're going to find it everywhere now. And the situation is still not resolved because we're still seeing in the commercial beekeeping world that the protocol, as I'm going to show you, is like we're still not learning. We're still not understanding that bees need to eat their own honey and not sugar water. Bees need to not be moved around the country every month, all year long, to be healthy. And we're still not learning that antibiotics and even a new vaccine for bees that has been created is not like the solution. So we still see colony loss every year in the commercial beekeeping world, wavering between 30 to 60%. And at its worst, like I think in the 90s, it was almost 70%, 80% loss of hives every single year. That's like thousands and thousands of hives that died at the end of every year. So yeah, it's very hard when we talk to other natural beekeepers. One of my mentors, you guys didn't get to meet, Michael, but I keep bringing him up with Apis arborea. He doesn't even believe in varroa. Like he doesn't even acknowledge that it is a problem. So it's really fascinating that the spectrum of perception on these things. In my experience, though, I have lost hives to varroa, and not necessarily from the varroa itself being in infestation, like a huge quantity within the hive. It's actually been the transmission of other pathogens that they've brought into the hive that for me. One of those being deformed wing virus, which is a virus that the varroa can transmit that ends up deforming the wings as the bees are developing, so that when they are hatching, they're unable to fly. And so you can see how that is like a serious problem for the bees. So anyway, I encourage you to, once you have a beehive, if you have a beehive, to kind of get a sense of this varroa situation, and then like do a sampling once. And again, I'll show you how to do that next week, but do a sampling once or twice, or maybe 1 year, and get familiar with the process. And then like from there, you can decide like how you're going to acknowledge the varroa situation. So like the commercial standard is that if you do a sampling, which literally means like you're collecting bees in a sample into a jar, like into a mason jar, and you wash them with alcohol, which is sad because you do end up killing bees. You wash them with alcohol, and then you strain the bees, and the liquid, the varroa goes through the filter onto a paper or onto a plate, and then you end up counting how many varroa is in that sample, right? And so if you have, as it says here, 2 to 5 bees or bees, 2 to 5 actually varroa per 100 bees, then that's like a low enough percentage, right? But anything higher, they say, than 5% is where you have like an infestation, and then they can come in and really cause damage. So like I was saying, I alluded to, I had lots of hives in Southern California that had varroa that never ended up having any problems. So it also comes down to a conversation of like genetics, and also, you know, what kind of landscape the bees are exposed to and what kind of health they have, honestly. This was from one of my textbooks from when I was doing my master's in beekeeping that I'll send to you so you don't have to look at it like this. But these are some of the other pests and diseases that you may or may not come into contact with. But this is there kind of like as a checklist for you to look at. And so as I was talking about, right now, the peak population for varroa mite is right now. And it peaks like usually right before the excuse me, the population of the bees is also at its peak right now at the end of summer. And the mite population peaks right now also, and a little bit within the next month. And that makes sense as there's more larvae that's been laid. There's more opportunities for the mites to reproduce within the hive. And then eventually they'll phase out by the time the cold weather comes. So yeah, this is the time where we're checking. These are just like really technical charts that if you were to do a sampling, you would refer to a chart like this that shows you, you know, what kind of levels you have. This one is actually saying that anything over 2% is, or 3% is like danger. And what the recommendation is if you have varroa, then you need to treat immediately. And we'll talk about some of those treatments. So here is a long list of different types of treatments that people are using out there in the world, both at the hobby level and commercial level for taking care of varroa mite. For me, I have never used any kind of chemical controls except for essential oils. Apiguard and AP Life are basically strips that are soaked in essential oils and placed into the hive. And actually, we saw that little picture of it up here. These strips that you place inside, and the idea is that the vapor, the volatile oils of the essential oils are then passed throughout the hive and is enough to take care of the infestation of the varroa. I have tried those in dire situations and they seem to really help. But then there's other very intense synthetic chemicals and acids that people use, where basically you're fumigating the whole hive. It's gnarly. I can never bring myself to do that. It becomes a question of, you know, your own morality, your own ethics. Do you fumigate a hive, literally like blast them with a chemical cloud, or do you allow the bees to maybe live out their destiny and maybe the hive collapses. So this is like the ultimate question that ends up coming up, right? Sorry, 1 second. I'm getting a text about the child upstairs. Okay. And then there's non-chemical controls that you can try, which are great solutions that a lot of folks that I have worked with or learned from have had great success. One of the first being that using a screened bottom board, the varroa mite will fall off the bee quite often, or after it is done, like attaching itself to a mite, or excuse me, to a body. And if you have a screened bottom board, meaning that bottom board that doesn't have just solid wood, then the varroa mite will fall out of the hive, which gives you more of a success of getting them out, as opposed to just falling onto that wood and being able to crawl up again. Some folks will destroy and remove brood from drones. If there is an infestation or high number of varroa mite, being that if we remember the drone brood, which are the males, they have a larger cell, which means that the varroa has an easier chance of getting into that cell and attaching itself to larvae. So you'll find that there are some beekeepers who will remove the drone brood, and that does mean destroying them. And that way getting like a break in that brood, or excuse me, that mite production. There's also some techniques you can do with the actual brood of the worker bees that can help with the mite numbers. And then, of course, if you're finding that, you know, if you're getting bees from a certain beekeeper and it's been a few years where you've lost hives from that beekeeper, probably would not want to use that source anymore. Or a lot of people, like I have a colleague down the road here, this woman who's been keeping bees here for, I don't know, 10 years. She buys a very specific queen from Georgia that she has found has amazing genetics, that has mite resistance, and her bees never end up with high numbers of mites. So that's another thing to investigate. Any questions so far?
I have one.
Yeah, please.
The powdered sugar method, do you
Yeah.
have any thoughts on this, or
Yeah.
have you seen? Because that's what I haven't done it yet, but that's kind of what I've
Thank
heard.
you. Thank you for mentioning that one. Let me write that down. And I'll make sure to show you guys that in the video next week. Okay, so powdered sugar method, and also something called the bee gym. So when we're talking about bee genetics, one of the things that bee breeders are obsessed with is something you'll hear called hygiene. Like, how hygienic are your bees, okay? And that means, like, how good are they at keeping themselves clean and the hive clean? Now, being that the varroa mite is this fairly large organism that attaches itself to the bee, how come I don't have any pictures? I'm sorry, like, why don't I have pictures of the varroa mite to show you on a bee? I guess I don't have it in this slide. It's so lame. I'm sorry. But anyway, one of the things that the bees can do is clean each other to get the mites off, which you'll find that they do. They try to like bite the mites off the bodies of each other. And so the powdered sugar method is a great solution and works fairly well. If if you have the presence of varroa mites and maybe it's not over a 3% population, but what ends up happening is you dump a bunch of powdered sugar on top of the boxes, meaning you take the lid off and you're working on the brood boxes. It's usually about maybe, I don't know, 1 to 3 cups of powdered sugar per box. And you sprinkle it on top of the box, and it falls down onto the bees and into the frames, and it coats the bees in sugar. And you're thinking like, oh my God, doesn't that like kind of hurt them? Can they breathe? They can breathe. And what ends up happening is they have to clean themselves. So they end up cleaning themselves of the sugar and then effectively getting most of those varroa mites off. So you would want to do that with a screen bottom board. Make sure you have a screen bottom board, right? So that the varroa can fall through. It doesn't necessarily take care of the varroa that's inside of the brood cells where they're reproducing. So the mite not only attaches itself to the brood cell, but that's where the female will lay more eggs for more varroa. But if you do this a handful of times within a month, you may find like a break in the reproduction of the mite, which ends up can be very successful. I have a few colleagues that will do this preemptively throughout the summer. You can do it once or twice a month just to ensure that like that cleanliness is there, so that if they come in, they do make their way into the hive, then they start to take care of it right away. So I think it's a great method. I've had success with it. And then there's also something called a bee gym, which I'll upload a photo for you. It's an invention that you put it at the entrance of the hive inside of the box, and it kind of has these little fingers on it. And it's a way for the bees to like scratch up against it to like get the mite off. So it's very cool. And that usually gives a lot of success to the hive as well. Great question. Thank you for bringing that up. There's like the fly situation this year, so annoying. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm sorry, I have the screen off a lot right now because
Okay.
yeah, I'm trying to multitask a lot of stuff. So you may have even addressed this particular one. But we just got back from like a big trip to town, and I'm like was like unloading the car and putting everything away. But just the other day I went to my bee guy, like the store here and that we have close by, and he mentioned the mites, and it was the first that I like. He said, have you treated for the mites yet? And I said, oh no, I haven't. And I was like, what, like, you know, what mites? So then he explained it, and he said, this is what I have to use. So I bought it because I of course asked him, like, I was like, so like, does everybody treat for them? Like, or is it like 50-50 chance that I have them? Or he's like, and then he, you know, said, well, everybody has them. And yes, you have to. And so it was like one of those conversations. I was like, oh, okay. So it's called Formic Pro.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's more like what is in it, right? Formic acid.
Yeah.
Which he said this was like not gonna hurt the bees, not gonna hurt the honey. It's like a naturally produced thing. And so did you talk about this one?
Yeah, just briefly. So it falls under like the acid category.
Right.
I mean, yes, it's like if you know, it's a naturally occurring.
So it's still an acid, but yeah.
It's naturally occurring. But yeah, this is again and then he's telling you that you have to do that because there are other beekeepers out there who will come and tell you that if you don't treat, then you are endangering every other hive in your area.
Right.
So this narrative is familiar, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Your narrative in lots of contexts.
Yeah. So
Okay. Well, that's good to know. And then like, because this has been like so helpful, all the information you've given this time around. Like, oh, so I'm feeling like, I feel like I'm a noob still, and so I'll just keep kind of going forward and with like trying to just do the things that are going to keep them alive. And then as I start to feel maybe a little bit more confident, start to be a little bit not experimental, but I like the sound of that like sugar one, but at the same time, like that sounds like it just helps them clean themselves and keep it. Yeah, anyway, I don't need to take up more time. Thank you. And also I thought it was interesting, he mentioned that in Newfoundland they don't have the mites yet, which is one place on earth. I'm not sure if there's other places on earth that don't, because he basically said they're almost everywhere, but Newfoundland is like it's an island off the top of Canada, and it they don't have it there yet, so they're trying really hard to not get it, but
right. And I invite you to read do a Google search on the varroa mites in Australia. The varroa mite was not in Australia up until this last year, and so now there's a really serious situation where the governing bodies there are trying to just destroy every single hive being kept there in order. They're like frantically trying to prevent the spread. But yeah, it's horrible. It's really horrible. What's happening there in Australia, because they're also trying to destroy wild hives. They're asking people to give them the location of wild hives, which is very devastating, like, because that's where all that richness in genetic diversity lies. So yeah, the one other thing I wanted to say is that, typically when you have a new hive, your first year, like, at least I saw for myself here, that the first year is really hard on the bees when you get it as a nuke, or as a swarm in the springtime, because sometimes depending on the weather, like your window is not that long for them to build up. And so maybe in that first year, it's just something for you to think about. Maybe in that first year, you go a little bit on the extra preventative side. Like, I am giving the couple nukes that I got in May some sugar water because they're still just not big enough. And honestly, I'm going to combine them because they're not going to make it through winter in that size. And so if your hive can make it through the first year, including winter, and comes out through winter to spring, then typically that hive will be successful year after year. It's really the first year that is really hard to get through that hurdle.
Yeah, that's perfect for me, and in terms of where I'm at with my journey. But I also am just curious, because you mentioned it, like the wild hives, how do they do with the mites? Like, do they find that wild hives have the mites but seem to be like balanced enough that it doesn't it doesn't affect them as much? Okay, that's what I was thinking.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and the other argument is that there's another argument for the genetics that come from Africa. So we talked a little bit about like the Africanized beehives that are in the southern part of the United States, and then definitely down into South America. Those genetics were brought in from Africa, and a lot of those bees that live in those regions do not struggle as badly with varroa mite as the commercially bred bees. So there's like two things to consider here. Take for example, Georgia, the state of Georgia is a big major exporter of honeybees. Both like packages like we talked about and individual queens. So there are a significant amount of bee breeders there because the climate is really nice. And so bees that were bred there in captivity are not going to have those genetic lines that these Africanized bees do. And when we see more of the Africanized genetics, it's in feral hives, meaning like the hives I worked with in Southern California were a combination of bees that were bred in captivity and bees that had been existing in the wild on its own for a while. So when I would go to some beekeeping conferences, there's one called, well, it was a farming conference called Eco Farm that's in Monterey or Half Moon Bay. I went to a few beekeeping classes and they're always talking about Varroa, Varroa, Varroa. You have to do this for Varroa. And I raised my hand one year and I was like, my bees don't die from Varroa. Like I rarely lose beehives to Varroa or rarely lose beehives at all. And they all just were like, no way, there's no way. Like, you're crazy, of course, you know, but it was true. I mean, I was only working with feral beehives that I was collecting from, of course, they were in the city or in natural spaces, but they were coming from swarms of hives that had been there, or had mixed enough genetics that something was happening. There was more resistance, right? More immunity to some of these pathogens. So yeah, it's interesting. You know, you have to use your personal approach to it. And yeah, and then you have this conversation like with you, Jewel, up there, where these territories or these areas that are a little bit more sensitive to Varroa pressure, what is the responsible thing to do? Should you treat every time? Do you want your hive to be a carrier? Because that's what someone's going to tell you. Like if you're not treating, then your hive is allowing Varroa to spread to my hive, for example. So it's not, I don't have an answer for you. I just provide you the information to make your decision. So these have some videos that I'm going to link and you guys can watch on your own time. Lots of short little videos on what some integrated pest management looks like. This is going to show you how to take samples and how to do essential oil application, how to apply Apivar, how to apply Apistam, formic acid, how to do that one. So there's going to be a video for you to be able to watch. Hop guard is another one. And then some cultural practices, which is like what we talked about, taking drone brood out and things like that. So again, those videos will be linked for you to watch. We're not going to do it right now. Also how to requeen. And we're going to take a little break. When we come back, I'm going to use the rest of the time to talk about winterizing and preparing your hives for winter. You can think about any other questions you have right now in the meantime. And I'll see you at 5 till the hour. Sound good? Thank you so much. Okay.
Hi.
Hi, love. All right. So, we talked about Varroa and some of those other pests that you might encounter. So preparing for winter. In general, if you had favorable weather and lots of rain and a lot of forage, by now your bees should have built out 2 brood boxes filled with bees and honey, and ideally with a honey super on top. Some folks from Missouri, I think they might have been more northern, were sending in pictures to our Missouri beekeeping page with 3, 4 supers on top, which is crazy to me. But yeah, some people had a really great year for beekeeping and others didn't. We had a little bit of a drought here up until, I would say, August. We finally had a lot of rain. So yeah, the weather's crazy. And, you know, it's just another question to think about, the future of beekeeping as weather does go through different cycles. And the seasons seem to be shifting later, you know, like how can we, do we still get the opportunity to continue to work with bees? And if we do, then our responsibility, you know, also becomes greater, such that we're also committed to, like I mentioned before, when we had the pollinator garden lecture, like really becoming stewards of the greater environment, so that we're not, just not so attached to every ounce of rain that comes by or comes through, or the temperatures, the temperature fluctuations. You know, if there's an abundance around us, and if the systems are balanced, or we're working towards creating more harmony in the natural world, then, you know, we don't have to worry so much about these fluctuations. But anyway, by now, you know, we're seeing the season is shifting. I don't know for you, but the night temperature now is at 70 and even a little bit below 70. The days are in the 80s, low 90s, so it's definitely cooling down, and that cool, crisp air is definitely here. So as the bees prepare for winter, we're hoping that they're in a position where they have enough honey storage to get them through winter. And as I mentioned, you know, ideally you want to have 50 pounds of honey in that top super. And if you don't, you want to take a look and see what's going on in your brood box, and see what if you have enough honey in there. So there could be situations where you may not have a large hive. You may have a hive that's still in a single box. For me, I tend to combine hives, like I mentioned to you before. If they're only in a single box, I typically will combine them with another one and then split it again in the springtime. Not to say that you can't overwinter a hive that is only in a single box, but the chances are just going to be a little bit easier. So for you, Jewel, like, you're in an interesting situation in a different climate than me. I would recommend you reach out to the beekeeper that you got your bees from and inquire what his suggestion is considering the size of your bees. I don't know if you've added a second box or not, or if they're still in a single box. And if you're not there right now, I will remind you of this, but you want to just ensure that there's enough food. And for you guys in Southern California, you have a little bit more grace because you'll have flowers probably through November, and then they start fairly early again in February, March. So you can have a single box get through some of the cooler months for sure. So right now, the bees are raising the last generations. These bees are going to be the ones that will raise the winter bees. And the bees that are born like November-ish are going to live probably through, like for me, November-ish probably through March. So in the wintertime, they can live, 3 or 4 months, whereas in the summer, they only live for about 6 weeks. But again, depending on your winter and your climate, if your weather warms up sooner than mine does, then you're going to see these bees, the queens starting to lay more rapidly sooner, and then you'll have the next generations coming. So then what's also happening is they're restructuring the hive in order to keep things warm and optimal temperature throughout winter. They're actually going to move the brood, any brood that was in the top box, and they're going to move it down to the bottom box. And then they're going to put the honey and pollen on top. So they're actually going to like start moving things if it's not there already. And this is to provide some insulation for the heat that's created in the womb or the brood space. You have all this honey on top of it. It's going to provide some protective barrier and also insulation to kind of keep that heat centralized where the babies need it and where the actual hive clustering. So what are we doing at this time? So we're addressing Varroa concerns, which we talked about. We're going to do a sample test. We're going to do treatment if applicable. We're going to give bee tea. So you can make a tea of different herbals like sage, and I actually have a recipe for you in the classroom. There's sage, yarrow, calendula, thyme is a really good one. You make an infusion with water, and then you mix that with sugar to make the same kind of, you could do it that way, like same kind of sugar syrup. And then you can give that to the bees. That way they'll drink it more quickly. I've tried it just with water and they don't really touch it as much. So if you mix it with sugar, they'll drink it up and they'll get some of those medicinals, and that will just kind of like help their immune system with all those amazing antiviral, antifungal plants that we have access to. We're combining the weak hives or smaller hives. Clean water is always important at any time. Reducing the entrances, as we talked about, getting ready to put mouse guards on, using an entrance reducer if you're noticing that there's robbing happening. And then I include addressing fire safety because it is fire season for a lot of folks. And what's your contingency plan? Like, what's your plan if there is a fire in your area? Some people will tack their bees up if they have a place to evacuate to. Some people leave their hives. We've seen photographs of some of the more devastating fires in Northern California that go through some of these areas where a lot of bees are, beekeeping pockets. And, generally the bees will hunker down. If there's smoke in the air, they are not really excited to be out flying. And then there are plenty of hives that have survived fire being around them. If you were ever in that situation, you know, as soon as you could get back to them, to the bees, to provide them water, that would be like the first step. You know, that's like obviously an extreme case scenario, but if you had to leave them, and if you could get back as soon as possible, water would, and sugar water would kind of be like one of the first things that you would get to them until the landscape stabilizes. But yeah, it is a concern for a lot of people. And then the common problems that we've talked about, like starvation can happen at this time, especially if you've had a hot summer. There's not enough food. There's a lot of robbing that could be happening. Predatory insects coming out to steal food. And then we have, you know, collapse due to any kind of illness, nosema or varroa mite, things like that. So it's kind of, I would say it's the most stressful time of year for the bees because they're dealing with a lot of pressure, and then they're also trying to get ready for winter. So in the next few slides, I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the steps you can take to prepare for winter, and we'll get to see some beehives from around the world. The design on the left is one of my favorites. This is a really typical method of beekeeping found in like Lithuania, Slovenia, that area. They build these bee houses, and they have them stacked on top of each other like that and protected. And then you can access them typically from the back, or it's almost like a shed that you can walk in, and on either wall are the beehives, and you can access them, you know, from the inside, and it can be closed off. So it's kind of an interesting idea for more extreme climates, and they've been doing this style for many years. And of course, this is more of like an intensive beekeeping operation, but nonetheless, like I love this idea, and it also provides a lot of heat in the wintertime, thermal mass. So that's pretty cool. The picture on the right shows like a really common approach to insulating your beehive here in the States. You will often find this approach, it's, I would say, on the minimal side, excuse me, just using that like paper that goes under insulation. And so the black kind of helps absorb some heat from the sun, of course, and then it's providing mostly like a windbreak for the gaps in the boxes. And then in the wintertime, you will notice that people will shift the entrance of the hive to the top. You'll see a little hole there so that the bees go in and out through the top as opposed to the bottom where it might be colder. And then obviously this location had a lot of snow. I personally don't leave snow packed around the beehives, but then some people argue that it provides more thermal mass and more insulation. So I don't know, that one I'm not well versed in. But here's another example. A lot of folks, depending on, you know, where you are, don't even end up, you know, doing any kind of like wrapping. Here in Missouri, people tend to not wrap or provide any other real insulation, except in this picture you can see there's some additional like material on top that's preventing the cold snow from touching the actual lid of the beehive. So that is probably one of the most important steps I would suggest you take, is to ensure that the rain and the snow is not hitting your actual lid in the wintertime. Not only does it like degrade your equipment, but as we're going to learn, condensation is actually the main problem in winterizing beehives. So it's really good for you to have something in place, and it can be, you know, any kind of material that you have. Ideally, something that can provide enough thickness so it doesn't like, it's not super thin. This looks like thick, or maybe some like corrugated metal. You can use metal, yeah, there's all kinds of options, but you'll notice on the beehive all the way on the right, I don't know if I can zoom in on this. There we go. You can see that that's a mouse guard. It has tiny holes for the bees to be able to fly in and out of, but the mice can't get in. So that's what that looks like. Here's a log hive that someone has, and you know, with log hives, we've talked about this, like with Mick, that the log actually provides the right kind of insulation for the hive, so you don't really have to do anything else besides providing a nice weather proof roofing on top. Something else to consider is to wrap the stand with some fabricated metal screening. That way you don't have creatures that are trying to hibernate under the beehive or try to crawl up and under into the beehive. So that's another step you can take. And here's your really typical setup here in the States. I think this is actually from a client of mine. In the pictures, you can see the entrance reducer. These are just these little pieces of wood that have cutouts, and you place it at the entrance and it reduces the space that they can come in and out of. And that allows for less robbing, of course. And then there's a few options for people in the wintertime. When we're talking about these bottom boards, some people like to use screen bottom boards, and some people like to use wooden bottom boards, solid bottom boards. And one would think that the solid bottom board is the one that provides more moisture, actually provides more insulation. But in fact, we may have been discovering that it creates more condensation, which again, I'm going to talk about, but just for you to keep in mind. And again, anytime you have snow, after the snowstorm has passed, go out and sweep the snow off of your beehives. Here's another example of that mouse guard down at the bottom. Looks like they've put some fabric, protective fabric on top of their lids, and then something heavy like a big cement block on top, so your lids don't fly off in winter snowstorms or rainstorms. And they do fly off. It has happened to me, and it is not okay for your bees to get wet and cold in the wintertime. Here's one of those migratory sheds I was telling you about. I just love this idea. I think it's so fun to be able to move them around like that. Obviously that is a pretty serious winter location. So some folks will still use the skep design even in the wintertime, and technically that provides enough insulation for the hive. You'll typically find them in a wall, a rock wall, where they can get protection from the elements. So those also work for some locations. What else do I want to say about this one? Yeah, again, we're seeing, yeah, the airflow is important underneath. This one should have that screen on the bottom to prevent animals from hibernating underneath as well. You know, and even in these kind of conditions, like the bees can stay warm inside. It's pretty incredible, but they do have to work extra hard to make that happen. There's just some more examples of different winter climates. So this is in winter, it's the greatest season of mortality, obviously. I mean, bees can die really quickly or really easily in the winter. To survive the cold, they shiver and vibrate their wing muscles to keep the temperature inside of the hive. It's typically at 98 degrees, but when the temperature outside drops to 32 or less, inside it has to go up to 114 or more. So it's a lot of energy. And that's why they need so much honey to make it happen, right? So the ventilation becomes important because they could be using a lot of energy, and also there's a lot of like circulation happening with their breath and respiration, I guess you can say. So we find that screen bottom boards, even in wintertime for some climates, are helpful so that there still have some airflow. And we find that it's not really the cold temperature that kills the bees. It's actually the condensation that can happen inside. So when you have something hot inside and cold outside, right, it creates condensation, and the water vapor that is collecting inside, as if we remember like being in a car, or if you do it with a glass, you'll notice that it's either the water vapor is condensing on the sides or the roof. And when the bees are inside of the hive, if there's condensation and the water drops on them, that's what actually ends up freezing them. It's not like the cold outside, because they, have existed for thousands of years in cold temperatures. But what ends up happening is the condensation. And that condensation has only become a problem because we've put bees in these thin boxes. They're not in the thick insulated tree trunks, right? So the humidity and the moisture becomes the problem. So yeah, this is really, I think, what to keep in mind. You'll see a lot of folks focusing just on the insulation of the hive, like wrapping and wrapping and wrapping, but that can actually do more damage if there's no ventilation, right? Want to show you one of my colleagues in Montana. She's actually, if you are on Facebook and if you have joined the natural beekeeping group page that I've told you about, she's the moderator. Her name is Angela. And she has done a study on her own beehives year after year in Montana to discover that it is the condensation that is really detrimental to the bees. And for her, in such a cold climate, she's not using a wooden hive, but she's actually using a polystyrene made hive. So the actual boxes are made out of this like polystyrene material. But what she's showing, if we look at that left where it says wood hive, that's just our typical Langstroth box, right? And we know that they're not very thick. So if it's cold outside and the bees are creating heat inside, right? As you can see, the arrows are showing where the heat is being lost and also where the condensation is happening. And that black cluster, that black bubble is showing where the cluster of bees are typically in the box, right? So if that condensation is happening above their heads, then that means that it's more likely to fall on top of them and freeze them. If we go to an insulated wood hive in the center, so this would be something that I do. I have these standard Langstroth boxes, but in the winter I add these thick foam boards on the top and the sides. You'll see that the heat loss, and then you actually add a little hole at the top as well. The heat loss goes through that little hole, and the heat can also be lost from the top, from the side. But you'll notice though that that circulation, having the hole at the top, allows for that water vapor to escape. And there's no condensation that's falling onto the bees as much. Now, with her hive, she has this polystyrene hive, which you can decide based on that kind of material how you feel about it. But the heat loss is actually less, as you can see in her picture. And the condensation actually stays at a minimum and it's below the cluster. And she has a screened bottom board as well. So these are just, it's like, you can go into it a lot deeper, but in general, it's good to have this understanding so that we know, you know, the ventilation is important, but then you also have to take into all these other factors, like how much moisture is in your climate typically. Here, there's a lot of humidity where I live. For you in Southern California, not so much. But there still is going to be that condensation created. One of the most important things though is to add the insulation to the top, because that's going to be one of the highest places of heat loss. And if you see her polystyrene hive all the way on the right, you'll see how thick that insulation is on the top. And that prevents, again, that heat loss, that hopefully that heat will kind of circulate back down. And then if you have a little bit of ventilation, then you're allowing some of that moisture to escape. So the middle photo is what I did last winter, and had the most success so far here in Missouri. So some other things to think about. If you have, let's see, so 2 deeps, we want to have honey in there. We want to have, it typically, again, if you have 2 deeps of bees, the brood is going to be moved down to the bottom box. You're going to find honey in the top box. And then you can feed them sugar to water ratio 2 to 1 from September to October until the days are lower than 55. Once you get to 55 degrees, you don't actually want to give them sugar or water anymore because they won't be able to cure or store it because it's too cold. So if you live in a windy area, maybe you want to consider a windbreak. We talked about the mouse guards, and then those insulation. On the outside, you can do 2-inch blue board from Home Depot or the cozy wraps. There's actually, if you go to backyardhive.com, they now make hive insulation with sheep's wool, which is great. As soon as I can afford that, I'm going to move in that direction. Or you can, use what you have. If you have foam or whatever, anything that will be able to stay in place. I had to use a lot of duct tape. You have to get creative, if your budget isn't that great. But again, the ceiling should have double insulation than what you have on the sides, right? So then ventilation shows that depending on what kind of hive you have, you may or may not need that upper ventilation, but usually does help. Condensation happens in the coldest part of the hive, and then it will run down the colder sides and out the front. So you want to actually tilt your hives a little bit forward to allow any kind of moisture that comes into the hive during winter to roll out. Or if you have your screen bottom board, it'll just drop out. Like she says, better if you have the screen bottom board, you can pull out the tray that's in there, but make sure that you then put the hive on something solid like a piece of wood or a piece of plywood, and then your stand so that you're preventing the windbreak, okay? I'm gonna pause here because that was a lot of information. Does anyone have any questions or needs for clarity?
I have a question about the screen bottom you were talking about. That could be used all year. We don't have to be switching that thing by season, right? Because it's heavy.
Yeah.
And okay.
Yeah, for sure.
So just start that from the get-go, because it doesn't dip down below 32 very often, but it has, especially at night. We get some 20-degree weather at night. So right now I'm focusing on rebuilding and rehabbing, restoring the habitat before we get bees, but I still want to have that in mind.
Yeah. Yeah. I have had the most success with screen bottom boards. And I think, you know, for you, you might get away with, having the solid bottom board in the winter. But if you don't want to be switching them out, when I was living in Anza, well, it's not the same elevation that you're at, because in Anza that was, I think, 1,400 feet, but we definitely had cold nights, and I had solid bottom boards, and everyone did okay in that couple winters that we were there. So with the screen bottom board, there's also like a tray insert that slides into it that you can pull in and out. So if you know that it's going to be extra cold, you can pop that little tray in. And then you could also add some additional insulation just like at the bottom around the hive, like if you had wool or blankets or whatever. I've done that if I had to. But honestly, that solid bottom really helps, you know, mitigate a lot of that cold air from coming in. And what else?
Yeah, I think the part that I'm thinking about is like we're really dry out here, like super dry. It's a hard thing to get adjusted to, but you will, like 3 months after drying and cracking everywhere. Right. But then the like right now it's like raining, and then I think we're beginning our fog season. So we're like in the clouds. So then we have a really wet season as well. And not because it's raining, it's just because like we're walking in the cloud.
Right.
And the other thing was wind gusts. It's crazy. So like I'm thinking, where would I put these things? We do have a well shed, so I imagine like stacking it close to the well shed. Could the backside be covered like those portable things? Okay, so I'm thinking like put it there because there's no wind on that side.
Yeah, exactly.
But it'll be facing, I don't know if how it faces makes a difference either. So it'll be blocked on its west side, and so it'll be facing the east.
That's good. Yeah, that's a good thing. Yeah, they like to, you know, wake up with the sun, especially in the winter time. Especially in the winter time, you know, then they get that morning sun to warm up right away. So that's really good. Yeah.
And they might not, because we're also on the north facing side of the slope, and so we barely can. I mean, it's really.
That's something to think about. Is like your whole property is north facing?
No, but the parts that are, because we have a valley and our home is on this side. So we have some that is north facing, but it's you know, that's like the backcountry part of it. That's like we won't ever go there unless we want an adventure day.
I see. Yeah. Well, it's not that it's impossible, but it's definitely going to take them a little bit longer to warm up, you know?
Okay.
So I would maybe
people don't use like heat lamps, or like, you know how you have those grow lamps that provide heat and like sun. I don't know. I'm just like, I don't know if you've ever asked that, but I'm thinking like if we don't have sun,
you know what you should do? You should put a weather station where you're thinking about putting them this winter, and that way you can track the temperature throughout the day. Cool. And you know, you can get just like a really simple thermometer, and we have some that we keep in our greenhouses, and it goes right to the phone. So you have history of like the temperature each month. So that way you could see like what is the temperature fluctuation at, because that'll tell you right away, like when you get to springtime, if that's even a good spot or not, you know.
That's called what is that called? The weather
yeah, you can either do weather station or the
weather station kit. Okay.
Where's my chat? I keep losing my chat box. You can also look up GoVee, Govee. They have those wireless like temperature gauges, and but it takes record of humidity, dew point, temperature, all the things, and then sends it to your app on your phone.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Good questions. So here's more of this diagram. What is this one telling us? Oh, this one is showing you if you have supers on top, like what you would do. Again, she's working with that like polystyrene kind of hive, so it looks a little bit different, but this one says bubble foil wrap 2 or 3 hives together. Oh, I see. Okay, so this is showing that this hive looks like a Langstroth situation. They put bubble foil wrap on the sides. They have a screen bottom board. And then they're adding some additional probably taping at the seams, meaning like at the junctures between boxes. And then you have your medium hive box and then the top of the hive. Okay, so then winter feeding. So, you know, come February, that's when I start panicking, because by that time it's been, you know, 4 months since I've seen the bees really. And I am anxious for the cold weather to be over, but for us, it is actually the coldest month since we've been here so far. So I'm panicking because I'm thinking about the bees. It's been 4 months already since they've been really active. How much food do they have left? And so there's something you can do called the mountain camp method, which is what I have done and have had success. So this is to provide them energy to make it through those last weeks of cold weather until spring finally starts showing up, like when we have some warmer days above 55, above 60. And basically what you do is you would lift the hive really quick, the hive lid. You put newspaper just right on top of the bars, and this is on the top box. And then you use your hive tool and cut little slits in it, and then put 10 pounds of dry sugar, pour it on top, and then close the lid again. And that way they have access to sugar, and gives them some energy. It also acts as an absorption for any extra moisture that happens to be in the hive, so that works to your advantage. But again, this is kind of like if you're panicking and if you have long winters, most people will do this, especially in like the Northern Territories. I have heard from beekeepers here that they don't do any of that. They just let their bees have, you know, 50 pounds of honey and they make it through. But I'm like over cautious, and I've had success with that. There are other things that you can do. You can make candy boards. You make this like hard sugar, almost like, I guess it's like just candy, but you harden sugar through a process. And you can store them in the freezer. You make them ahead of time, store them in the freezer, and then you can just like slip them into the hive really fast. You can make fondant patties. It's another like, basically it's just sugar, but in a softer form like fondant. And you would make those ahead of time and stick it into the hive when you want to. And then if you're worried about like protein, if you notice that in your beehives, right now, before autumn and winter really set in, that the hive doesn't have a lot of pollen stored. They would be missing a lot of significant protein. So you can buy pollen patties that are essentially pollen and enzymes mixed together, and they form these like sticky patties, really. And you just throw those on top of the frames, the same way that we did the sugar, and you can buy those. And then this other Krabby Patty thing. This is from a bee nutritionist that my colleague had mentioned. You could make your own by blending sugar and pollen substitute powder, warm water, placing it in a Ziploc bag, and then putting that into the hive. So those are some options. Yeah, and again, it's not necessary really for folks in Southern California. Like if you have enough honey in there, it's going to be fine. But for those of us who have 4 or 5 months of cold weather, it's necessary. So, okay. So some of the fun things that you get to think about for the winter months ahead, I just want you to start thinking now, is how can you continue to connect with the bees in the winter time? And we may explore more of this at our autumn equinox celebration, but now's a good time to buy beeswax from local beekeepers, as they've been harvesting honey and melting down the wax. So I encourage you to think about candle making this winter. If you are able to, start collecting honey from different beekeepers in your area, so you can have it on hand to make electuaries and infused honeys, medicinal syrups as we go into cold season. And then if you can get your hands on some propolis, from now I recommend you make a tincture and store some propolis in your apothecary. You can keep it in the freezer as well if you get it just in raw form. If you keep it in the freezer, then you can powder it really easily to use it as a powder, or you can even make an oil with it. So just to kind of like put a bug in your ear right now to think about these things. Beeswax is so fun to work with. This year I'm going to try the luminaries, those pretty candle holders on the right, made out of beeswax. I'm also giving a workshop on candle making and how to make those little floating walnut shell candle as well. And then salves, of course, like one of the things that I always make. So yeah, winter we get to, of course, slow down, but there's so much crafting to be done. I don't do any crafting in the summer. It all happens in the winter. So yeah, and we made it on time with time to spare. Any questions?
I have one actually.
Yeah, go ahead.
My after this conversation, I think that I'm actually in the 2 swarms that I have, since they're only one deep box each, and one of them is not doing as well. But one of the other hives that I have had an awesome year. They're doing really, really well. Very healthy, with the exception being that the super that I put on top was completely foundationless, and they ended up building cross comb so cross that I cannot take a single frame out without totally taking everything out.
Yeah.
And I was kind of debating, going back and forth, like, should I just leave it so that they have something to eat, or should I take it? And my consideration, or the thing that I'm thinking of, the kind of the justification I'm making in my mind for taking it, is that they can't really So blah, blah, blah. The way that they they built it, there's a pretty much like a 6-inch gap between the corner of the box and where the first kind of comb is. And I'm worried that that's quite a lot of space. And that also for it to be reused, it's just always going to be a cross comb box, right? Because they're not going to like, so would you recommend just taking it and then giving them something fresh to start with next year? Or they're really they've got 2 full deep boxes. They seem really, really good. But my hope was that I was going to be able to give the extra honey to the other hives that are not doing so well and just probably putting it in with rubber bands. I'm thinking out loud here, but any feedback, thoughts, concerns,
Yeah.
comments on that?
Do you know if did they attach the comb to the sides of the box as well?
I don't think so. I'm not sure. I have to check.
Okay, so what you can consider is since those 10 frames are pretty much like one solid mass, right? Like that's what you're okay, this has happened to me before as well. So I like the idea of you giving some honey to the other hives. I think that's really smart. One thing you can try to do is take that super off, okay, bring it into your house. Get a surface where you can collect honey, like some kind of tray, right? Gently, well, first make sure that there's no comb attached to the walls of the box, right? And then you're gonna have to go one by one, dislodge each frame, just like by going underneath the part that hinges, making sure it's not stuck. The end goal is to try to like turn it over gently. Maybe you have someone help you so that the frames end up being on their back and you can lift the box. Can you lift the box that way? Because it's hinged. Yeah, yeah, right? And then you can lift the box up and then you're just left with the frame mass, right? Massive frames. And then from there, you take like really strong floss or a thin, clean wire and use it to cheese, like a cheese slicer through the frames. And then you can feed that to the other hives.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
And I don't know if I would still like, how many other hives were you wanting to give extra to? Was it 2?
I have 4 hives total. One of them has already been combined. And then the one that I combined, they're still not doing that great. And I might combine them again with another one. So then it would be 3. But two of the 4 right now are doing really well. And I think that they'll do fine through winter. I mean, they seem really healthy and robust and they're doing everything right.
Yeah.
So I would be giving it to the one that I'm going to combine.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay, so you could like easily give them probably like 4 frames, okay. And then you have the opportunity to replace those and that super with wired frames so that eventually you won't, eventually you can make your way, maybe next spring you can take that full super off again and then give them a new one to work with, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, thank you.
Right. Okay. Well, that was a lot of information for you to take in. Please sit with it, rewatch it if you need to, come with questions for sure next time. We only have a few sessions left with each other. So feel free to reach out to me in the meantime if you have questions. Don't forget to work on your final project. Does anyone have any questions about the final project or concerns? Go ahead.
Well, I was brainstorming the other night with my friend because I was kind of like, I was sort of feeling like I wasn't sure what direction to go in.
Mhm.
Um and yeah, so I guess I was kind of like, she sort of suggested that I do something kind of like that combines all the different things that I have like either been inspired by or made with the bees, or made with the honey, not their honey yet, but just that, and like make like a little like video, kind of like even like just like a reel type of thing, like not too
Yeah.
long, but like with little like little bits of all the things, and then maybe some of the writing, like, is something like that okay?
Of
I
course.
mean, okay, yeah, I mean, you
Yeah.
left it pretty open, so I figured, but I was, yeah, I just thought, okay, yeah, that might be a direction that because I was having a hard time like picking like one thing to kind of like,
Mhm.
focus in
Sure.
on. So yeah, this would be more of like a combining compilation of all the things.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Definitely.
Okay, cool.
Just like have fun with it. Don't let it be like, something that you're stressed out about. So if you're gonna have fun, then do it that way.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
And then I have one question about the gathering. So
Yeah.
is the date for the gathering official? It's set for that weekend.
No, because I just saw your comment that you could come after the 14th. So, um, yeah, I think we can, because I think it's only you and Jewel who expressed that they might be able to. So maybe we should talk offline about,
No, I can come too.
oh,
Um,
you can.
and I want to come. And
Okay.
the only thing is I'll have my kids in tow. So
Yeah, that's great.
yeah. And maybe the husband, but maybe not.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, that could be really cool because if you're bringing your families, we'll just turn it into like a little homesteading, bee, wild wilderness, whatever, camp out. So, um, let's, I mean, for you, Jewel and Veronica, does after the 14th of October work?
Like at this point, like I haven't even looked in on flights yet, like what the cost and stuff like that will
Yeah.
be. It's realistic for me to actually fly down for a weekend, but the idea of that is very appealing to me. So yeah, like as of right now, I don't have anything going on in the rest, like on the weekends yet in October. So like if you
Great.
guys pick a date that works for you two, and then I look into see if I can get some sort of cheap flight sale type thing.
Yeah.
And I would only like, I also like, yeah, I don't know like I'd have to fly in on a Saturday and like fly out on a Sunday because I'm
You're working, right?
full time. Yeah. So it'd be like one night. So we'll just, I don't know. We'll have to see. But
Okay.
yeah.
I will post then in the classroom right now what airport we are at.
Yeah, that would be
And so Marlena, are you saying after the 14th you're available? Is that what you said?
Yeah,
Okay.
the 15th through the rest of the
Okay.
month. Yeah.
Cool.
probably like that. There's the 21st, and then there's the 28th,
Right.
like on a Tuesday, the after the 20, like that weekend. So
Great. Okay. I'll put the airport in the classroom, and then you guys can look at flights and see what's realistic and respond there. And then we can start planning it. It'd be amazing.
yeah,
Yay.
Awesome.
fingers crossed.
I know. Thank you so much. I hope you have a blessed and beautiful day. Happy September. Palomina is what we say. Happy new month. And I will see you on the equinox.
Yeah, awesome. Bye, ladies.
Bye bye.